Okay, welcome everybody. Today we'll talk about filtering, aggregation, but first let's do a quick recap of views. What we talked about last, or on Tuesday. So multiple views have this, this idea of partitioning a data set or like complex data set, a multifaceted data set into multiple views that are either adjacent to each other or superimposed. And so the question here is, how do we coordinate that and why do we do this? First, this multiple views has this principle as I is over memory. So we have this idea that the things that we can see at the same time are simply easier to understand for us than if we do, for example, if you look at this first and then at this. And so we talked about a couple of options. If we have linked views are multiple views that are simultaneously visible and lined up together such that the action in one view linked up together such that the action in one view affect the others. So, and there you have a couple of options. So, for example, you could use the same encoding in two different views. That only, of course, makes sense. Like using the same encoding for the same data set, for the same subset of the data isn't very useful. So, usually, if we have the same encoding, we want to show more data in one view and then a more specific subset in another view. Kind of this implies this already. So, the other way of doing it is to use a multiform approach so that we, for example, show one visual encoding technique in one view and another visual encoding technique in the other view. So I had this example of a node link diagram versus a matrix layout for a graph to essentially use the best of both worlds. And so as I already implied earlier, this also depends on how are the data sets shared. It's either shared all, it's a subset, or it's not shared at all. And then for highlighting, the question is to link or not. Linked highlighting, linked brushing is a very common approach. And for navigation, the question is, do we share the navigation or not? Overview in detail is one specific example of this, where one view shows often summarized information about the entire data set, and then we have a second view that shows us more detail about one selected subset of the data set. So the idea behind this is that for large or complex data, a single view of the entire set cannot capture fine details. So we could have an overview of the whole world and then a second view with showing only one specific country. So this is an example for a genomic data visualization tool that uses this overview in detail approach. So here, we see a list of chromosomes, and this one chromosome here, highlighted between these triangles, is extracted here and shown in more detail. And additionally, this chromosome is shown in the context of another chromosome. Okay, and then we talked about partitioning views. So one of the approaches for partitioning are small multiples, where each view uses the same visual encoding, but shows a different subset of the data. And so this is good for easily comparing different parts of a data set by relying on eyes instead of memory again. So we had this example of a network that where we have node attributes. So we have in this case, a biological pathway, a network, and then the color of these nodes corresponds to the state of these genes. And so we can make these quick comparisons here, like this cluster here, for example, is upregulated, versus here it is downregulated. So the same, we see the same topology, but then we see the attributes highlighted in a different way. So partitioning is about separating the data into groups. And so we have a couple of design choices here. How do we divide the data up between multiple views? Give them a hierarchy of attributes. We can decide how many splits and the order of splits, and so on. And so what we typically partition by here are categorical attributes. And so we looked at this example of trellis plot. So trellis plot, this plot here, is a data set about barley yield in 1931 and 32. So first we partition by year, and then here we partition by farm. And then within these farms, we partition by the various barley strains. And so this kind of is a very, very effective way of comparing these elements. And then, of course, here the sorting and so on. We talked about this in detail last time. And then we had this example where we partitioned this space filling layout, this tree map in London. So here in this example, we partitioned first by house type, then by neighborhood, and then by sale time. And then we have these different encoding attributes, but we looked at this in detail last time. And then we briefly talked about layering, and layering is the most simple example for layering, are these line charts, and we looked at this like at the limitations of layering. Previously, when we have too many lines, for example, it is not a great idea. And also, you don't want to like, for example, use two different scales in the same chart and so on. And then I wanted to show this video, like kind of as a summary of multiple coordinate views. This is like, I like to call this multiple coordinate views to the max. This is a tool where you can essentially design pretty complex visualizations yourself, and then you can link between these visualizations, either just by colored highlighting, but also using these visual links. I'll just show you the video.
Domino is an interactive visualization technique for extracting, comparing, and manipulating subsets across multiple tabular datasets. This video demonstrates Domino using a music charts dataset. You can download a demo version and the dataset at domino.kaleido.org. This is the main Domino interface. It consists of a Domino board and a block browser. The block browser shows a list of all loaded data subsets. Domino distinguishes between three block types. Partition blocks show categorical data like gender. Numerical blocks show numerical data such as the release year of the first album. And matrix blocks show item combinations like the count of #1 hits for each artist in different countries. Relationships are represented in different granularities and directions using lines and bands. Placeholders and live previews help to add new blocks. When dragging an element from the block browser onto the board, possible drop positions are indicated. When entering a placeholder, a live preview of the data is shown. By dropping the item, the selection is confirmed. Domino allows users to quickly create advanced setups. Blocks can be added. Visualization types can be switched.
So here you see that like each of these blocks is one view, and then we also define like how do these views interact, how can we visually represent the relationships between those views. In this case, using explicit linking. And so using this kind of technique, this very flexible idea, you can actually create pretty complex
relationships.
Pretty complex visualization techniques just using these primitives. So there is a so this is like kind of you can see that there's a couple of established visualization techniques that we can easily build here. So here we have a scatter plot matrix. Everything here is interactive. Then we have a parallel coordinates plot, and then here is a parallel sets plot. This is called flexible linked axes, and we'll talk about this when we talk about tabular data visualization. And all of this is based only on these like very simple grammar units. Okay, so that concludes the recap from from Tuesday's lecture. And then today I want to talk about filtering and aggregation. Good, so first a couple of administrative words. This week and next week, remember tomorrow you need to announce your project group. So the link that I've sent out, please use the form to announce your project group. If you haven't yet found the group and if you haven't contacted me before, please come and talk to me after class. And this Saturday homework 5 is due, and on Monday your project proposal is due. And so for the project proposal we've just added an assignment on Canvas, but please only put the link on Canvas to your GitHub repository and put your project proposal into the GitHub repository. So that we have like one project proposal per group and not multiple project proposals. On Tuesday then we have the peer feedback session where you come in here and give each other feedback. Please remember that this is mandatory, like you have to be here, at least one person of your group has to be here. A couple of people have emailed me about this, and so I'll work something out with them in person. If you cannot make it, please email me or see me after class. And this is also going to be graded as part of your project milestone. So the result of the peer feedback, there will be instructions, of course, that should go into your GitHub repository, and we'll look at this together with your milestone. And then next Thursday, I'll be at a conference, and I couldn't find a guest speaker, so the class will be cancelled. Okay, let's talk. Any questions? Yeah?
Is this our last homework?
This is the last homework, yes. From now on, it's all about the project. And that also means that we will be not holding regular office hours, like scheduled times anymore. I will, but not the TAs. You will be assigned, after this homework, you will be assigned a TA that supervises your group throughout the rest of the process, and then you can make appointments with your TA directly, like schedule appointments instead of having regular office hours. Any other questions about any of these deadlines? Okay, so filtering and aggregation are kind of the key ways of how we can deal with larger data sets. And so we'll talk about ways to filter data and then talk about ways to aggregate data. So we can always filter based, now, if you think about this in terms of a tabular data set, we can filter based on items, or we can filter based on attributes. And similarly, we can aggregate based on items, or we can aggregate based on attributes. So when we filter, the idea is that we eliminate elements. And so the question is, what drives these filters? And so it turns out that any possible function that partitions a data set into two sets works as a filter like this. So we can say something is bigger or smaller than x. We can define a fold change between two, let's say, dimensions, or we can filter out noisy or insignificant data. And of course, since we're talking about interactive visualization, we are also very interested in dynamically querying and filtering. And so we have seen this idea of dynamic queries and filters, where it's about coupling between the encoding and the interaction so that the user can immediately see the results of an interaction. So instead of running a query and then executing it on the server and retrieving a result, you change the slider, you highlight that element, and the filter dynamically is applied. The distinction between queries and filters is if you think about it, this is actually pretty subtle. So queries is essentially you start with 0 and then add in elements, whereas filtering you start with everything and then remove elements. And whatever the approach that you take depends on your task and on the dataset size, right? So if you have, for example, as we saw, this houses in Washington DC, then filtering, of course, makes sense. But if you want to retrieve information from the internet, you don't want to filter down from all of the information from the internet, but you want to query first and then potentially filter. So here's this interesting historic video.
We feel that the greatest gains to be made in person at that time, not only in calculation, visual display
Just
concepts,
as a recap,
projects dealing with real estate information, sports statistics, health data, computer directories. We've also looked at the video stores.
So this you've seen this similar video for Washington DC.
During this coming
housing
year,
prices, but here I want to show you the film finder.
The tool we've developed is called Film Finder. The Film Finder can be used to quickly locate, browse, or scan information about thousands of films. Films are presented in a star field. Each category of films has its own color: drama red, mystery blue, etc. New films are on the right, popular films on the top. With the category buttons, we can select a subset of the films. We can zoom in to a particular part of the display we're interested in. When there are few enough movies in the display, the film titles show up. We can select films of a particular length using a double box slider for range.
So this is an interactive query,
For
in this case in a separate widget.
We can use our new alpha slider widget. It consists of 3 parts.
Okay. So here, like we see the initial set of all of the attributes, and then once we have defined these filters, like for example here, looking by a certain length, and then defining for one specific actor, we see the subset of movies that apply, that essentially is the result after these filter operations were applied. And so here's an interactive example, which is also fun to play with. This is a map of New York restaurants and their healthcare, and their Department of Health violations. So, for example, the New York city government does these inspections, whether these restaurants are up to regulation, and then give grades, and these grades are public. And so we have grades from A, B to C, and so we can look at all of the C-graded restaurants, and there's fortunately not a lot of them. Or we can look at the B-graded restaurants, and then we can filter by violations. So we can say, okay, show me all the B-graded restaurants where there was evidence of rodents. And so now you can actually like look down into this restaurant, whether the restaurant where you regularly have lunch in has like evidence of rodents in whichever form that is. When you look at these historically, as a film finder, for example, you saw that the widgets were usually separated on the side from the main display. And so this kind of like introduces this extra complexity, so that you have this, like you don't know exactly what, you have no specific idea of what the action that you're going to trigger with your filter is going to do to your data set. And so somebody came up, like Wesley Willett and colleagues came up in 2007 with what is called scented widgets. And scented widgets, they combine data visualization with classical user interface widgets. So for example, here we have a histogram overlaid on this slider. So if I filter based on this, I know from, like if I filter from here to here, I know that, okay, the majority of the data set is going to be in that filter. Or here for this faceting interface, we know that by looking at, it's hard to see here, but we know exactly like what is the rating that you get for these various options. Or here there is like a color-based heat map behind these widgets, behind this list selection widget. So you can see the data set, this is the size of the data set. You can see that data set A is the largest one. And then here we have like a categorization on top of these, this tree hierarchy into people. So the idea of scented widgets is to make these user interface widgets smart by overlaying some information about the data on top of them. And you could also have interactive legends, like we have here. So this is like, you see the legend of these bubble charts, and we can dynamically change the filter's bound. So we can change the filter's upper bound and the lower bound, but this is directly combined with the legend. So this is from 1 to 30, and here I'm currently running the filter from 6 to 25. So this is a similar idea. Okay, so now I want to talk, like filtering is the simpler operation of these, that we usually define some like data-driven query or filter, and what is more interesting is aggregation. So aggregation, when we aggregate data, it's about representing a group of elements by a typically smaller number of derived elements. And whenever we group something, we kind of lose information, so we want to be smart about grouping elements. So we'll first talk a little bit about some basic aggregation methods for statistical graphics and so on, and then I'll talk more about clustering, dimensionality reduction, and so on. So for item aggregation, like the classical aggregation method, just to see how the data is distributed, is a histogram. So in a histogram, well, all we do is we create a number of bins and then count how many elements fit into that bin. The problem with histogram is that a good number of bins is often hard to predict. So there's like a rule of thumb that you can try with the square root of n, but in practice, depending on how your data is distributed, the good number of bins is really hard to predict, so it's better to make this interactive. So here, for example, if you look at this number of passages versus age, you kind of miss this effect like if you bin it like this, you miss this effect that there's a lot of passengers between 0 and 5 years and not so many between 5 and 10 years, for example. Of course, if you have too many bins, you get artifacts that are not really in the data. Another approach to histograms are density plots based on kernel density estimations. Or this down here, what is called the rock plot, where each of these items is actually represented, so that this is not strictly speaking an aggregation technique, but the kernel density estimates are a good alternative to histograms. Then a very commonly used approach are box plots. Box plots are also known as box and whisker plots. How does a box plot work? So you take a distribution like here, and then you define the median, and on the median you show like this strong line within the box. And then you have quartile 1 and quartile 3 define the borders of the box. So this is called the interquartile range. And then the whiskers indicate quartile 3 plus 1.5 times the interquartile range. However, this is by convention, so this can deviate. So usually when you use a plot like this, you should always specify what you're showing in the whiskers. Box plots are very popular, very common. I also use them occasionally. They're good for normally distributed data, but they're not so great for data that has a multimodal or a bimodal distribution. So here, for example, this is one single box plot and 4 different distributions. So this is like, whenever we aggregate, we lose some kind of information, right? And if we do a box plot, the box plot is really only valid if we have this assumption of a roughly normal distribution. So we could have like this bimodal distribution results in this box plot. We could have this non-bimodal distribution with one peak in the center, but this is of course not a normal distribution. And then we could have like one outlier skewing the box plot here. So box plots are good to use, but you should use them with caution. And also, what I didn't say earlier, if you have any outliers that fall outside of the whiskers, you should always mark those outliers, because very often outliers are interesting. There are also like extensions that, for example, notched box plots. The notches here show 1.5 interquartile range divided by the square root of n. So this kind of gives you a better idea of the distribution. This is you can see this is a guide to statistical significance. However, in practice, they're not used very much. So here is an example of a couple of box plots and how they look for different distributions. So here we have a box plot for a uniform distribution. Here we have a box plot for a normal distribution. So notice that here the outliers are highlighted, and this is roughly what you would expect. Here is a box plot for a Partition distribution and then for an exponential distribution. And if you look at these distributions in any other way, you will find that this is not a very good representation that the box plots do here. So like a normal distribution is what you would expect. Uniform distributions is not really what you would expect here. And the exponential distribution and the Poisson distribution. The Poisson distribution is kind of okay, but the exponential distribution is very unintuitive. People also visualize this data usually when it is about some statistical tests, also visualize this as bar charts plus error bars, but this is generally not recommended because this completely hides the information about the distribution. A compromise between a box plot and visualizing an explicit distribution are violin plots. So here we have the 2 box plots and the corresponding violin plots, and you can see that this violin plot here kind of shows us the bimodal distribution, which the box plot hides. So violin plots are a decent solution, but they are of course harder to make and more difficult to interpret. Maybe, well, these are by convention, people understand them. These would be actually more easier to interpret. So there is a study on visualizing and analyzing distribution. The paper was called "Error Bars Considered Harmful," and they explored the expected values and the uncertainty across this distribution, and then did a study on how correct did people understand these distributions? And they found that, well, first, those two here are not really like good for showing distributions. This was about error bars and uncertainty, and they found that this faded bars are actually very easy to interpret, and the second best result were the violin plots. So if you're interested in this, I recommend that you take a look at this paper. Another approach for aggregation are heat maps. So whenever you have scatter plots, for example, if you draw a lot of points on top of each other, you will lose, you will have a problem with visualizing these densities because at some point everything will plot each other. So instead of drawing every point, you can calculate a grid and bin this grid and then record and display these intensities. So here would be a scatter plot, and here would be a density plot, a heat map of the same scatter plot. And this is an example that uses these density plots to visualize the scatter plot, the bin scatter plot matrix, in this case in a web implementation. And this is a very efficient approach of doing this. So like we can see, like this is a scatter plot matrix, and we can highlight each bar here in the distribution, or we can highlight individual cells in each of these scatter plot / heat maps. And this scales up to 1 million of points in your browser without using a server-side, any server-side rendering or any server communication here.
So are these just different representations of the same data?
These are multiple dimensions. So we have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dimensions in a matrix. We'll talk more about like scatterplot matrices and so on in the lecture on tabular data visualization. But of course, if I had 1 million data points and I would try to render 1 million data points in the browser, that would be not very efficient.
So the violin plots, are they really just a mirror image of the distribution, just plotted by category, I guess?
Pretty much so, yes. Yeah. So it is kind of like a distribution turned upside, like a histogram turned upside down.
Right.
So is this a 2-dimensional matrix, or is it actually a 3-dimensional one?
This here?
Yeah.
It's a 5-dimensional matrix.
Well, what I mean is like the degrees of freedom that it has. Is it?
So what you see here is
there another depth per each cell?
what do you mean by depth? So what you have here is like you can think of this as a table with 5 columns, and it plots every dimension against each other. Like if you have 5 dimensions, you can take dimension A versus dimension B, dimension A versus dimension C, and so on. And this is exactly what this does here. And I can switch the number of dimensions. So here we're doing a 3-dimensional data set. So this would be 3 columns in a table and 1 million data points in 20 bins.
So the diagonal row is comparison with itself?
Exactly. So that's why there is a histogram in here. So and also, as you can see here, this is symmetric. So the bottom left and the top right are exactly the same thing. So we'll talk more about this when we talk about scatterplot matrices. Here I just wanted to show the aggregation aspect of it. This is also an example, like from the literature here. There is also like, in addition to just using overplotting and binning, there is also a color coding used, a continuous scatter plot. And I forgot how much data this is exactly, but it is an amount that is very, very high and from an engine simulation. Okay. So the next thing that whenever you do something in the continuous domain, like on a map, we have to do some kind of spatial aggregation. And so we have this like modifiable areal unit problem. In cartography, if we change the boundary of regions used to analyze the data, we can get dramatically different results. So for example, here are 4 different binnings. And you can see that like, if we color code by these aggregation methods, we can see that the results are very different. If you just looked at, if you didn't have the points here and just the color coding, we would assume that this is very high, but here we see that this is kind of uniformly distributed almost, and so on. So does anybody have an idea of where this could be a big problem in around this time of the year?
The election.
Yes, for election data. This is kind of the problem that you have with gerrymandering. So gerrymandering is about like, the way the American electorate system works on a district level is that these the districts are awarded to the votes are awarded by districts. And so by essentially changing the geography of the district, you can change the results of an election. So if we have this example here, where we have 60% of people blue, 40% red, how can we slice this up geographically? So first you could do it like this, and then we would have a perfect representation. Only blue people would live next to each other, only red people would never live next to each other. And so here we have then like this corresponds exactly to the distribution, but of course this kind of representation is not very likely. So if you do a very compact representation, in this case it is also unfair, because based on the system you have like 6 blue and 4 red cells in each of these squares. So in this case the blues win 5 districts. But you can actually find a shape, a form, where you kind of cluster all the blues into as few districts as possible, and those few blue districts, they're won by the blue party in this case overwhelmingly, but the majority of them, like the red ones, are distributed such that the majority of the districts goes towards the red party. And this is not only a theoretical concept, as you all know. This is an actual district in Pennsylvania where Democrats won 50% of the vote, but only 5 out of 18 House seats. And it turns out this is not only a problem in Pennsylvania. So here's an example of Utah. And Utah is, of course, known that it has a rather Republican state overall, but the city of Salt Lake City is known to be rather liberal. And so this is what the district map in Utah looked when Utah still had 3 congressional districts. So you had one eastern district, one western district, and one district for the city of Salt Lake City. And then when the 4th district was added, Salt Lake was sliced up in a way that is paired with these larger rural blocks which are overwhelmingly conservative. And ever since that, Salt Lake City has never had a congressional, a representative that was a Democrat. One potential spatial partitioning are Voronoi diagrams. Voronoi diagrams are an efficient way to partition this. So the question here is, given a set of locations, for which area is a location and the closest? So there is, you can build these Voronoi diagrams in D3. I'll show this a little bit later. So the idea here is that each dot has a shape that is exactly between those two, at half of the distance between those 2 points, we have these borders here. And again, between those 2 points, we have this border here. So each shape gets the maximum of the area that is kind of uniquely associated with it. So here's a Voronoi map of world airports. You can see that the cells, the Voronoi cells over land are of course much denser. Over sea there is not a lot of airports, so these Voronoi cells get rather big. And Voronoi is also very useful for interaction. So we can use Voronoi diagrams to increase the size of a target where we can click or hover. Because if we work, for example, with a scatter plot, to highlight a point in a scatter plot, we have to hit the point exactly. But if we use a Voronoi tessellation in the background to identify each of these points, we can just get into the region of this point and then highlight it. So here are 2 different examples for that.
So Voronoi is independent of the attribute, it's only based on location?
Yeah, so this is just the spatial partitioning. So here in this plot, you can see that I don't actually have to hover over the specific points. I can just go into the neighborhood and it will automatically highlight that. Okay? And so in comparison to that, here's a plot where I actually have to hit the point. And so this is much harder to do. As you can see, like it takes me more time and it is more difficult to hit the specific point. And so how this is implemented is the mouse hover or mouse click event is not actually based on hitting the point, but on hitting a hidden Voronoi cell here in the background. So we can see this even better in the second example. So this is for a line chart, and this like here you can see that just by going right or left, I kind of like hit the corresponding time point very precisely. And if we want to look at how this is tessellated, we can show the Voronoi diagram here, and then we can understand clearly how each point on the line is highlighted. Of course, down here, this is not as useful, but if you have any like any regions in between, with Voronoi tessellations, they do help a lot. So how do you construct a Voronoi diagram? Well, I'm not going to cover this in detail, just to give you an idea of how this works. If you're interested in how to do this, I would recommend an algorithms class or just reading up on it. But the basic idea is that you calculate a Delaunay triangulation, and Voronoi edges are perpendicular to the triangle edges. So here we have the Voronoi cells in bold and the triangulation in the background. And whenever, like you can see that for each of these triangles, perpendicular to it is an edge of the Voronoi cell, and then whenever you hit another line, you kind of like end the line. And so how do you calculate the Delaunay triangulation? It's basically, the algorithm works like as you start with an all-encompassing fake triangle, and for existing triangles, you check if the circumference of the triangle contains a new point. So you want to add a point, you want to add a point for the triangulation. So in this example here, you check which of the triangles in this triangulation, if you draw a circle around them, where this point, for which triangle this point is actually within the circle. So this is the point to be added, and so we draw these like circle segments here, and we can see that this is the convex hull of the existing triangle. Is the hull in this case, of course, not convex. This is the hull of the triangles where this circumference, where the point is within the circumference of these triangles, and then we would simply add new edges from all of these corners here. And this is how a Delaunay triangulation works. And once you have a Delaunay triangulation, you can simply generate a Voronoi diagram out of that. Okay, so next I would like to do a design critique. Anybody still missing? Okay, as usual, take a look at these questions, take a look at the tool. This is Gerrymandering. If you remember in the very first lecture, I showed you this video of Hans Rosling describing how the world has changed over time with regard to public health. So you can go to this website. There's this Flash-based tool. It will take a while to load. And so we'll take a look at this Flash-based tool. This is pretty interactive. This is not as usual, like usually what we do in design critiques are presentational visualization tools, but here we are using actually a data exploration tool. So take 5 minutes, talk to your partner, to your neighbor, and explore this technique, and then look at these questions, take notes of these questions, and then we'll discuss this visualization technique. You're welcome to talk to your neighbors. Okay, so what is the data we see in this visualization?
Income per person over time.
Income per person over time. This is this particular view. I see you didn't bring your computer, so.
It's life expectancy as a function of the average GDP per person in the country.
Yes, so life expectancy and then income per person. What other data is shown here?
There's actually a lot of data that is shown here. Like, for example, like there's like tons of indicators that when you go into the options that are available.
Yes, so I could also show life expectancy, for example, versus child mortality. So this is what I said, this is an interactive exploration technique and not specifically just a presentation technique. So you can actually switch between all of these different data sets here. So how is time work? So what other data is here? Like we talked about the axis. On the x-axis we have, in this case, now child mortality, and we have life expectancy. What else is shown? Which other data is shown?
Time.
Time, yes. How is time shown?
Well, you can switch the time button. You can also animate it.
Exactly. So you can essentially either scroll through it, or I can switch to time. And what another feature for time?
Oh, sorry. I thought you were still asking me what other features are shown.
Sure, go ahead.
I was just going to show population by country.
Yes, exactly. So this is another data. Yes. And so how is population per country shown?
What's that?
How is it shown?
The area of the circle block.
Yeah.
And I guess the color.
The
Not
color.
but identifying what nations are which.
What does the color show?
What?
Geographic region.
Or is it GDP? I haven't gotten that far.
Geographic region.
Yeah. So it's continents, regions. It's actually not continents because we have like a separation of Africa into Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And India is also separate. Or South Asia is also separate.
You can change that as well.
Yeah.
You can change, oh yeah,
Yeah.
good. So it's very interactive. So like what happens when we like click one bar here? This is kind of an interesting encoding. If we highlight one specific, okay, as an Austrian I'm going to highlight Austrian. And so we should get a trace of how Austria behaves over time using this animation. So when do you think this strong outlier here happened?
World War II.
Yeah, exactly, it's World War II. So, do you guys find the interactive features valuable here? If you think about what we talked earlier about, like multiple coordinate views versus this animation here, what would you prefer?
Animation.
What's that?
The animation will be better than.
So, if you had an animation, do you now know, like you know for Austria, which is highlighted here, how it behaved over time, but do you know how India changed over time?
Well, you can select each of them and put the trail on them, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you have to essentially interrogate it consistently.
But if you have multiple views, then there'll be like too much information on the screen for you to process it. This allows you to like specifically select what you want to see.
Yeah, that's true.
It's not hide. It's not hidden, or like you don't have any distractions to things that you want to see.
Yeah, so if you want to ask a specific question, I certainly agree. Of course, you couldn't even do like showing every year in a multiple coordinated view way, right? So you would have to find bins, for example, and say, okay, every decade I'm showing the average, for example, child mortality. So did you find the tool, like the features easy to discover? Is this well designed?
The map itself is well designed, but the features are harder to find because you don't realize that there's no indicator marking saying that there are additional features.
Yeah. What is, like, did you discover how to change scales? Anybody?
That's right. Yeah, I was just going to make a comment, kind of in answer to your question. Is like there's a lot of information here to like play with in interactivity, but they don't do a very good job of like cues and could you call it sense of how to actually interact with the graph. Like there's there's a new version, I guess, at the top that I went to, and those, on that one, I realized you could actually hit play and see it, right? The play button just kind of meshes into all the other information. So it's,
Yes. So there's a tool, and so you can actually see that this is a re-implementation of this whole tool, and this is a D3 re-implementation actually, versus the earlier one was a Flash-based implementation. So here you see the year embedded nicely. So it is kind of a cleaner and more modern user interface, but still it kind of remains true to the previous representation. So did anybody play with the map view? Takes a while. So I think that the map here seems to be actually broken. Something is wrong with the projection. So that's not a particularly useful feature in this case because there's an immense cluster of countries which should probably be Europe. So yeah. Any opinions? Do you like or dislike this visualization?
I have a question about the map.
Sure.
So where did the axes go? How are we gonna show the information on the map?
You don't. It's only about what you can code in the bubble size.
Oh, I see.
So, like, of course, this is always the problem with if you have, if you want to show data in a geospatial context, you lose your ability to present the data, like to use position to encode the data. So, any opinions? Anybody want to share? Like, is this well designed? Is this communicative?
I don't know if it's necessarily well designed or not, but I like the fact that you have the option of either exploring the data, or if you know what you're looking for, it's not that hard to actually find it. That's interesting in my opinion.
Yeah, so you're saying it basically makes a pretty complex data set accessible, and you can answer targeted questions very efficiently, if I want to paraphrase you.
Yeah, but at the same time, you can explore the data just for the heck of it.
Yeah. Any other opinions?
I think there's enough features on this chart view that once you start figuring things out, it starts making sense, you're cool with that, and then you move over to the map and it's totally different, and you lose a lot of the features, and so the map then feels awkward. Not necessarily anything wrong with the map, but just because they've gotten used to the chart and they didn't separate the two.
Yeah, so that is a good point. You could maybe have made this better if you show the map as a second view and not switch to it, but show it in addition to it in some way. And so you have this geographical context. And that is generally, when we talk about maps, this is generally my recommendation, to never use like a map as your primary data visualization tool, but use a map to give context and then use a separate view to visualize the data.
Yeah, so while all the features are really useful, I found them very dense. And like somebody else said, you kind of have to figure it out for a little bit. But I think something that would have really made it more smoother is if there was more of an overview first, then you can zoom into the details.
So what do you show in this overview first?
Well, I don't know. There's definitely a choice of data that this person is trying to display, and I'm not sure what their idea was.
So instead, for the axes, where you get to select from a drop-down list box, instead you can have, say, a toolbox of icons.
Yeah.
And each of that will show to you so that you have these options in the first place, and it will also allow you to like.
Well, but what would be the disadvantage of that?
It would seem too cluttered.
Yeah, so you get a lot of entries here. This is actually like a nested menu, right? So you have a 3-level like murder rate and so on. So this is a very rich.
So you can have for each of those main levels, you can have a single icon, and when you click that icon, you can have a drop down from that, which is also icons that select something.
Yeah,
So
I think that there is like definitely like ways to improve the selection interfaces here.
Another thing I found irritating with the map is that I think the circles and their colors are kind of redundant because you already have the geographical data available to you. you could just use the borders of the countries and like maybe color the countries themselves.
Yeah. So what does this tell you? I think the map here is very much an afterthought. Somebody said, oh, we also need a map. And the whole visualization technique is not really designed to work with the map. It's just like somebody put a picture of a map in the background and positioned it by geographical position.
There is some use in the circle still, because you can change what variable
Yeah, exactly.
displays as well.
So you can display anything, life expectancy here instead of population size. And then you can also vary the size of the circles. So yeah, so this is like an example of a data exploration tool versus a data presentation tool, what we usually look at. I think that this is okay design, but not necessarily the best design ever. There is like, the scatter plot itself is very effective. The data that it contains makes it very accessible for, let's say, a non-technically skilled audience, right? You can easily like explore these data sets even if you have no idea about visualization. But at the same time, the interface is already a little bit dated and a little bit clunky. So there's like improvements that you can make, yeah?
Just out of curiosity, do they have these information available to public?
Yeah, it's this is probably United Nations data. There is like on the course website, if you go to resources, there's like links to these OECD data sets. There's also a link to a lot of public American data from data.gov. So these data sets are publicly available. Okay, any last comments before we go back to the lecture? Okay, so for the rest of this lecture I want to talk about attribute aggregation. And so we'll talk about two different ways. Group attribute and computer similarity score across the set, and then dimensionality reduction. So to preserve the meaningful structure of a data set. And I want to start with grouping of attributes and computing a similarity score. And so like the most important way of grouping attributes is of course clustering. So clustering is about classifying items into similar bins. And the similarity is defined based on a similarity measure. And conceptually I can use a lot of different things as similarity measure. Like for example, I could use an Euclidean distance, I could use Pearson correlation, I could use a Manhattan distance, or I could even use custom user-given or expert-given similarity measures. And so in terms of clustering algorithms, there's a couple of different classes of algorithms, and of course there's different classifications, but I personally prefer this classification. So one class is partitional clustering algorithms, which divide the data set into a number of bins, and these bins can either be manually set, like in k-means for example. K-means that you have to specify how many bins you want to have in clustering, or it can be automatically determined. So you don't tell the clustering algorithms how many clusters you expect, the clustering algorithm figures this out itself. One example for this is affinity propagation. And in contrast to these partitional algorithms are hierarchical algorithms, which produce a similarity tree. They essentially cluster items based on similarity with each other, and then have to build up a similarity tree, and then you can cut this similarity tree, this dendrogram, to find discrete clusters. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about k-means and about a hierarchical agglomerative clustering algorithm. Then there's also biclustering algorithms that cluster both dimensions in the record. For example, a global ordering, a global partitioning at the same time. And also kind of like probably the most accurate presentation of many real-world data sets, but not very popular because of its like challenging properties, is fuzzy clustering. So in fuzzy clustering, you assign a node or a point to a cluster with a certain probability. So you say this point here is in this cluster with 75% probability, in this other cluster with 25% with 20% probability, and then this other cluster with 3% probability, for example. So there you can have elements in multiple clusters. You have this probabilistic view of these bits. And so with regards to visualization, of course clustering is a popular machine learning, non-supervised machine learning technique, but with regards to visualization, applications of clustering can be used to order whenever we have pixel-based techniques. So we will talk about how important it is to order a matrix. If we, for example, want to use like an adjacency matrix to visualize graphs. We can use clusters for brushing, for geometric techniques, and we can use clusters to aggregate information. So this is kind of the the thing that we're talking about right now. And the idea behind aggregation is that the clusters themselves are more homogeneous than the whole data set. So I can somehow represent the cluster abstractly and still retain a lot of the information. So here is an example of ordering. This is a clustered heat map. So you can see this is a gene expression heat map from a brain cancer data set. And you can see that there are very clear distinct patterns. So we see 4 clusters here. In this case we have the patients in a row and genes in the columns, and this is clustered with respect to both patients and genes. And you can see that we have essentially one patient cluster here, a second patient cluster here, a third patient cluster here, and the fourth patient cluster here. And this is a very effective visualization technique in terms of scalability, because here we see a lot of data. These are 1,500 by 500 dimensions data points. So we can get a good overview of this. And a heat map here is very efficient to visualize these clusters. If we do, for example, a parallel coordinates plot, that is basically not very helpful. So this is kind of the same data visualized as a parallel coordinates plot. So a cluster heat map, it's a pixel-based technique. Therefore, the order here matters a lot. And if I apply the right clustering here, I can actually see structure in the data set.
What are the vertical distinctions?
The vertical distinctions? These are sets of genes. This is clustered in both directions in terms of patients and genes.
So you have 4 patients, 5 sets of genes?
No, you have 4 groups of patients and 5 groups of genes, 5 clusters of genes. So these genes have in this patient have a similar pattern, a similar expression patterns in this case. We can do this, here this is an example of a visualization technique that allows these cluster comparisons. So here we have 2 different groupings, and with these pullouts we can actually look at what are the details of such a heat map, and then we can see how does it split up, like this cluster here, how does it split up in this other data set or in this other clustering. And so we can see that this here, see the details about it here, and then we see that it splits up pretty wildly. Here, the elements that are pretty highly expressed in this group here are very lowly expressed in this group here, for example. And so here we see, again, some of them are highly consistently expressed in this group and also highly expressed in this group. This is an example of a cluster comparison technique. And here we have an example of an aggregation technique. Again, this is a similar data set. In this case, we have a time series, like times of 1, times of 2, times of 3, times of 4, times of 5. And by using clustering, we don't actually have to show, each of these bricks here represents 50, 100 samples. And by having the underlying assumption that the clusters are homogeneous within themselves, we don't actually have to represent all of the data. We simply can get away with representing this aggregate representation here.
So in your previous slide, the clustering is happening on the right side of the visualization, right?
So these are actually 2 different data sets, or 2 different parts of a data set, this one and this one. And the clustering here are these groups. So this is one group, this is the other group. And then we see, here we can, this is a technique that allows you an overview in detail. So here you have the overview. And so this is an interesting cluster because it is, it shows the change over time. So here we're looking at this cluster in more detail. We'll look at one specific element, and then we can trace this specific element. Where does it cluster in this other group of patients?
So you have a large set of data, and each of these blocks is actually aggregated.
Yes, it's a division. But we're not aggregating here, we're just splitting it up and ordering. So there is no summary. It's just we're showing all the raw data, but it is sorted and divided based on clustering. Okay, so let's. I want to talk about 2 different clustering techniques. I want to talk about k-means and the hierarchical algorithm. And so the idea of k-means is to minimize the aggregate intra-cluster distance, which is also called the inertia. So what we're doing here is we're trying to find the minimum, like a partitioning into k clusters that minimizes the squared distance of a point to its centroids. So like the inertia describes the square distance to the centroids, and what we want to do is to minimize this inertia, given a specific k. So for Euclidean distance, this here corresponds also to the variance of the cluster. And so this is like inertia itself can also be used as a measure how internally coherent clusters are. Now finding this in a globally optimal way is NP complete. So this is basically very hard to compute. And so therefore there's algorithms that find an approximation for this, and one of the famous algorithms that does an approximation for this is Lloyd's algorithm. And so Lloyd's algorithm is like the standard k-means algorithm, and so as an input here you have a set of records from xi to xn and the k. The k gives you the number of clusters. And so you pick k starting points as centroids from C1 to Ck, and then you run the algorithm while not converged. Okay, first talk about how you pick a starting point. So the starting points, one simple way of picking a starting point is just picking a random position in your space. Another strategy is to just pick a random point. There is more efficient strategies like the k-means plus algorithm, who first picks a random point and tries to maximize the distance to the next point it picks. But I don't want to go into the details here. So just like think about it like picking a centroid as a standard, like as a random point. So maybe it makes sense if I quickly draw this.
Is k provided? Do we have to decide, or is it just defined by like the task that
I'll talk a bit about how to choose k, but usually you have to provide it. So there's methods to pick a k, there's silhouette analysis, you can look at the inertia of a particular clustering, but the assumption for this basic algorithm is that k is given, like an input parameter, a user chosen parameter. Okay, so let's assume we have like these 6 points here, and they kind of form a cluster, and then we pick a random position for a centroid, and then we pick another random position for a centroid. And so in the first step of the algorithm, for each point x we find the closest centroid. So we look at each of these points, where is the closest centroid, and for these 3 points here, very clearly this is the closest centroid here. And so it kind of like this partitions the space, well, maybe not the best point because I'm already done. Let me do this like that. Okay, so here I would have probably like a partitioning of the space like this. So this point here is closest to this centroid, and these 2 points here are closest to this centroid. Right? And so the first step of this algorithm assigns this point here to this centroid, these 3 points to this centroid, and these 2 points to this centroid. And then, like now we have 2 clusters. Of course, these 2 clusters now at this point only depend on the position of the centroid, which is random. So we kind of have a random cluster step. So the most interesting step in k-means is now that for each cluster J, we compute a new centroid by calculating the average of all the points that were assigned to this cluster. So for this centroid, this means this centroid is going to move in here. And this centroid here is going to move somewhere, well, the average is probably down here. So we see like this goes here, and this goes here. And now we redraw this cluster border here and reassign these elements, and we can see clearly that this is going to be somewhere like split along here, and we already have the correct cluster assignment for this simple example. Because we've uptraded this centroid to be the average of all of these points, it moved over there, and then we reassign in the next step the points to the cluster.
Quick question.
So, yeah?
What happens to that circle that you had initially? Now it's on, it's in a new centroid. Yeah, that one.
Yeah, so this is reassigned to another cluster. Essentially, after each step of this algorithm, like when you're done with step 2 and you've assigned the centroids, you throw away the cluster assignments and completely compute the cluster assignments from scratch. And therefore, the points switch the cluster assignment to the new centroid.
So this only applies to graphs or this visualization that have no centroids or just nodes that connect each other, right? So those do not work.
You mean node link diagrams or
Yeah,
graphs?
so that kind of idea does not apply to this form of algorithm?
You can cluster a network with k-means. You just have to think like, so here, this is easily illustrated by using Euclidean distance, just spatial distance. But for a graph, you would use a graph distance, for example. And then you can also do that. So like instead of, you pick one node randomly, you compute how far are the points removed from it, for example, and that could be a distance measure. So you can replace this Euclidean distance measure with other distance measures.
So how do you find the number of iterations which I need to do?
So
Until it's done.
this is, well, done is hard, but this is exactly what I want to talk about next. So how often do we do this? We repeat until convergence, and how does it converge? Does it converge? Does it find a globally optimal solution? No, it doesn't, but what is the criterion? When do we stop this loop, right? And the simple criterion is to stop the loop when no point has changed cluster assignment between two runs. So like in this case now, if I run this again, like here, the centroid might be updated again to be here, but this is not going to change the cluster assignments. This centroid will also be updated to be here. Again, this is not going to change the cluster assignments. So in this case, we could have a terminating condition that the cluster has now terminated. There's also other terminating conditions. For example, you can say the distance between the old and the new centroid are below a certain threshold. So if you say the centroids only move by whatever, like 1% of the data space, or you could say we have a maximum number of iterations. So like usually there is, like, since it's not necessarily, most of the time this terminates pretty quickly, but it is not necessary that it terminates quickly, so you usually have a fallback number of loops as a terminating condition. So here's the illustration again of how this looks like. We start with these 4 colorful centroids and assign each of these nodes to it based on these decision boundaries. And then we move these nodes, the centroids here, and then reassign and in the next step then reassign these cluster boundaries, and then we continue like this and so on, and then this will eventually find these cluster borders. So here's an interactive illustration of how the algorithm works. So I'll pick the centroids, I'll do a Gaussian mixture initialization. I'm making it hard for the algorithm. I'm picking this, let's say this, and this. And then when I execute this, you can see which points are assigned to what. I'm moving this over, and then now I'm reassigning points. Moves over, reassigning, moves over. Now we have converged. Now the algorithm has converged. I can probably find a situation where this doesn't really work out fine. Let's see. Yeah, so here we see exactly the problem of this algorithm. This is not going to find a global optimum. So I can now run as often as I want. Because I did a stupid initialization, we can see that this gets stuck in a local minimum here, that this cluster is not separated. And that is, of course, a problem. And so, why is that? Okay, well, I'll talk about this a little bit more. Let's first talk a little bit about choosing k. K-means is, of course, very sensitive to the choice of k. So here we have 2 plots. In this case, we clearly see 3 clusters, but the clustering algorithm, which is labeled by colors here, found only 2 clusters. And here we have, again, like one of the problems with local minima. So how can we choose k? No, I didn't just grab this. Okay, so very quickly about how I could choose a k. I can, like, visualization is a good way of choosing a k. If I see this like this, and then we see that these clusters are well defined, then you might have a good k. Another way of choosing k is that it turns out that you can calculate this inertia, this global error function, and if you like initialize this, and you have like, you plot the error for k is 1, k is 2, k is 3, k is 4, and you plot the error and you have a 3-cluster solution. Like your data set has 3 clusters, and I'm trying out these 4 different k's, I will find something like this. So like here is an error, like the error for 1 is pretty high, then the error for 2 is lower, then the error for 3 is suddenly very low, and then it tapers off. So the error for 4 is still lower, and for 5 is still lower, but here we have this like tapering off point, and at this point, this is the best solution, like the best case for this particular data set. Because here the error was reduced significantly and now it tapers off. So this is a way of visually spotting a K if you run this with 5 different Ks, for example. So Lloyd's algorithm, as we saw, doesn't find a global optimum because like, you can get stuck into these local minima, but it is very fast. And so one way of dealing with this problem of not finding a global optimum is simply to run it many times. For example, if you use like a standard implementation of Lloyd's algorithm in scikit-learn, it became, because of this inertia function, it assumes that the data is roughly circular in size and that the clusters are also of equal size. And so here are a couple of examples that I played with. Essentially, Kimi is here, so this is here. So these shaped data sets don't work well.
So in that scenario, your K is 3, right?
Yeah, the K is 3, and here's the K is 3, like the correct number. For all of these examples, I picked the K so that it corresponds to the real cluster.
So you have K centroids, but you still have to deal with the problem of where you place these centroids initially, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And so, like random would be one approach, but how to like even make them perfectly. If I place one centroid here, one centroid here, one centroid here, it will not find. And then here, of course, this is also tricky. Means it kind of like assumes this is one blob and this is the other blob. And equally here, even for such a blobby structure, it assumes like a continuous blobby structure because of this inertia criterion.
That right seems like you can easily fix it with like a feature space expansion.
Exactly, yeah.
Because it's just a function of radius as well. So
Yes, so you can transform this into polar coordinates and then you can cluster it. If you know it, but you can also use another algorithm like a hierarchical algorithm and we'll pick this up from the beginning.
So for radial data like that, is it possible to have the center in one cluster and everything around it in another cluster?
Yeah, that's what he just mentioned.
Oh, okay.
So there is algorithms that will actually pick this, like do this correctly. Like a hierarchical clustering algorithm will do this correctly most of the time, especially if you add an additional criterion of connectivity. The K-means, like you could transfer this into polar coordinates and then you would have 2 bands and it would probably do it right.
Would something like Voronoi be applicable here, since you're like somehow geometrically dividing your space based on your data?
Yeah, so Voronoi and K-means, because you have the squared error function, they kind of, you can think of as like the cell that the cluster centroid describes as a Voronoi cell. So it's like essentially, if you take the centroids and throw a Voronoi diagram over it, you exactly have the cluster boundaries. K-means is also not so great with unequal cluster sizes, although that is, like, in this case, well, this is a tricky situation. Like, this is not really a well-defined cluster, so you could also argue that there's 2 clusters here, but you can see that this is certainly not a good clustering. Okay, so I think I'll talk about hierarchical clustering next time. It's 3:20, so next time for me would be in 2 weeks. Next week, Tuesday, don't forget, mandatory attendance for the feedback session, and Thursday no class, and then I'll see you again next Tuesday.